Welcome back to Questing Beast. I'm Ben. Today we're going to be taking a look at these review copies I was sent of Megadungeon, which is an OSR zine put out by Courtney Campbell. Courtney is most famous for writing the Hack and Slash blog, which is one of the best OSR blogs out there. Certainly one of the ones that got me into the OSR, and it has a lot of fantastic resources and essays on the old school style of play. So let's look at what we have here in Megadungeon. There are 3 issues out so far, and they chronicle and describe Numenhalla, which is Courtney's personal Megadungeon. We have a lot of essays, a lot of really excellent essays, I should add, throughout all 3 of the issues, going into the rationale behind Megadungeons, how they work, why they work, and so on. For anyone who's interested in that style of play and is thinking of creating their own, it's a great resource to have. As always, links will be in the description below for where you can pick it up for yourself. Brief overview of Numenhalla. So Courtney really takes a very old school approach to Megadungeons. So in contrast to something like Barrowmaze, Numenhalla harkens back to like the 0th edition days of D&D, when the entire campaign would take place in a dungeon, and the dungeon was a mysterious, weird, almost psychological place where the dungeon could extend infinitely downward and sideways and in every direction. It was constantly evolving, constantly changing, could never be fully explored or mapped. And he really advocates that style of play, where crawling through a mega dungeon is more like crawling through the referee's mind than exploring a mapped out, very specific place. We look at some basic mega dungeon play and procedures. For anyone who is unfamiliar with the style of play, it's a great overview. A couple non-player characters. The gods of Numenhalla. So the gods play an important role throughout this mega dungeon. You can contact them through the use of altars. And there's a bit of faction play there, some psychology where you're dealing with these strange immortal beings who have fallen from their once high state, but may still have an influence, especially over this place. Most of the gods are drawn from mythologies, but it's a combination of different mythologies all kind of mushed together, which makes things a bit less predictable. And we have the first section of the dungeon. Now, the thing that is really fascinating about this zine and about Numenhalla in general is the way that it is presented as a very modular mega dungeon. Rather than having a big complete map and then marching through it step by step, he presents each section of it as a themed zone, almost, where there's a lot of modularity. You can rearrange it in different ways. You can take different sections of this dungeon and simply connect it up with something that you already have. Right? You have a secret door that just goes somewhere, attach on part of this dungeon, and you're good to go. So we begin with an entrance hall, along with some mysterious mirrors that you can play with, and a section with a lot of statues of gods. What we see here is his design for how-to key rooms. I've seen this very early on in one of his earlier blog posts, where he describes how to do this like bullet point format. We see the same design in the Dark of Hot Springs Island, or something very similar to it, where you have the room, and then you have in bold the main things that you see right away, and then we have next to it more detailed keywords, so that you can create your own descriptions just by quickly scanning them, and underneath that, more and more detail. So by scanning through these bullet point descriptions, you can quickly pull out just the amount of information that you need. It's all hierarchical in its layout. It's really great. I really like this style of keying rooms. We have a new class, which is basically a type of golem or robot, along with different modules that you can attach to it. How skills work in Numenhalla. And this dungeon is designed for 5th edition, as well as old school D&D. So all of the monsters come with dual stats. So that's convenient if you're into more recent rule sets. And we have an Etterkop key as well for this spider-themed little module that you can stick onto your dungeons, along with some monster stats here at the very back. Quickly looking through some of the other ones here, we have Megadungeon number 2. I really like this illustration on the front. I believe it was done by, let me double check here. The cover is done by Sam Mameli, who does a lot of great old school art. And as we go on through these zines, we see more and more great art by a wider variety of OSR artists. It really becomes kind of a who's who of great artists. Some more information about how to use it. How do you use a Megadungeon? How to make it meaningful, and how to make it a strange, mysterious, like psychological journey into the mythic underworld. So the main feature of this section is the Hunting Halls of Tethys, which is this large labyrinth-like section of a dungeon. And like in the previous issue, it's very modular. You can tack it on to something that you already have. But it has its own themes, its own lessons to be learned, its own tricks and traps. And that's one thing that I think Courtney really excels at. He has some great documents over at Hack and Slash on, for example, tricks and traps. And it's a very thorough, comprehensive document on all the different ways that tricks and traps can be used throughout dungeons. And we see them put into practice here. A lot of ways that you can mess with players' minds. For example, in this one, there's a section of the dungeon over here. Once you enter it originally, then a gate closes and you're trapped there. And you can get out of here by going through one of these one-way doors. Once you go through one of the one-way doors, this gate opens. So you need to find your way back again. But the only way to get back again is to go downhill, which is very counterintuitive in a dungeon. Normally, going downhill takes you to deeper and more dangerous areas. So it plays with the player's perceptions of how dungeons work, along with having a number of different factions and some interesting monsters and plenty of little puzzles built into the landscape that players can try and solve to get more treasure. One thing I would like to see improved on this is that the margins should probably be expanded a bit. This is especially true in the third issue, but we see that the numbers for the different rooms end up being wedged fairly deep into the spine, which makes it a little bit hard to read. So some wider margins, I think, could help there. We have treasure listed on this side, while we have room descriptions on this side. And everything has its own little typographic key. So if it's bold with like a dotted underline, it's a type of monster, right? So you can see those very quickly. There's little keys down here, like there's an I with DC 16, which means perception, DC 16, if you're using 5th edition. Or things like a little lock, DC 18, for, an DC of 18 to pick the lock, and so on. So using little symbols actually makes it even faster to read, because you can simply scan for those symbols. What it does is it just downloads the basic information into the DM's head, and it makes it much easier to improv descriptions, which I really like because I don't like reading box text. There's some rumors and quests. We have a little side mission that you can go on. Once you get to an altar of one of these gods, your mind can be transported into this ethereal realm called the Logos, and there's like a little adventure you can go on there. We have another little adventure going through this very technological themed dungeon. One great thing about Numenhalla is that, like a lot of very old dungeons, there's a wide variety of types of encounters. So you'll see weird science fantasy mixed with very classical, like mythic fantasy. We have a little trap intersection here where lots of different levers can open doors in different combinations. Some cool treasure maps you can throw at players if they find scraps that can give them clues to how to unlock bits of the maze from back here if they want to find even more treasure. A wide variety of town activities. So here's what to do when you go back to town. Most of the adventure takes place in the dungeon because it is a mega dungeon. But when you go back to town, you want to have downtime activities, essentially. And here's a number of carousing tables that you can use in order to spend that gold and gain experience, right? Do you want to spend it on philanthropy or study and research or eating or whatever your character likes to do. Some cool non-player characters. And we have dragons. One cool thing is that a lot of the random encounters in Numenhalla at least one entry is often a dragon, which I really, really like, since that's something that's often neglected. Dragons are often held up as this sort of boss encounter that most players aren't going to run into. But the game is called Dungeons and Dragons. If you're in a dungeon, there should at least be some odds of you running into a dragon. How wandering monster tables work and why they work, and a really great little twist on the typical wandering monster table. So we have, this is a guest article by John Bell, who proposes that what you could do is create a list of monsters as usual, but also have layer monster noises, tracks, spoor, or traces along a different axis. So you roll on both axes, and then you get a lot more variety in terms of the things that you discover. For example, you can hear noises of the monsters, or see signs that they pass that way, or maybe find their lair. It just adds a lot more variety and allows players to use problem-solving skills to track down monsters or avoid them, and it makes the dungeon feel a little bit more alive. I think it's a really cool idea. A couple of monsters, along with some great illustrations, and some stats for 5th edition, if that's what you need. Looking at our very last zine here of Megadungeon, this has a cover by Luka Rejak, and I'm pretty sure I'm mispronouncing his name, so sorry. But he's a great illustrator. He's in the middle of doing a great Patreon for the Ultraviolet Grasslands, which many of you may have heard of already. And he did a cover here. We have a preview of some other gods. And the main section of this zine covers an area called the Crypts. So here's a little bit of background. And we start getting into the Crypts. I really like Courtney's cartography. It's sort of a pseudo-isometric look. The main downside is that it's often reproduced at fairly small sizes. So a lot of the detail I feel is lost. And it's hard to pull that detail out into your descriptions. For example, it's often hard to tell where exactly doors are just because things are fairly small. Now, the descriptions of the rooms do include things like where the doors are, but having more detail in the pictures, or perhaps making them bigger, maybe taking smaller sections of these and blowing them up, I think would have made it a lot easier to read at a glance. Here we have random encounters. You can see there's a dragon on there, along with some dungeon effects. What's really neat here is that occasionally you'll come into a room and it cuts to a side view of the room, if the room has some verticality. So for example, room 14 over here, there's a zoomed in picture so you can see what's going on underneath there. That's really neat. It's very easy to read that way. We have some great illustrations down here of some murals. It looks like they're done by Evelyn Moreau, I believe. It looks like her style of drawing. The upper crypts, some catacombs. There's this very textured and dense style of illustration here that Courtney seems to favor, and I really like that. I just wish I could see it a little bit better. Lots of descriptions. Again, descriptions are all very terse, but often have a lot of information packed into a small space. We have some rumors and tasks available in the crypts, some cool weapons and items, and flexible nodes. So here is a wide variety of very small bits of a dungeon that, again, you can recombine with other bits to create your own mega dungeon. We have an organ mine, the crystal wizard crypt, the witch's crypt, and it has a bit on non-Euclidean intersections. So basically a circular intersection where, even though it's in a sense it's circular, players perceive it as being straight. So if they looked straight down this hallway, they would be able to see their own back looking that way. So you can occasionally present these kinds of non-Euclidean intersections just as a weird thing for players to puzzle over and eventually figure out how they work. Although he does advise not to do this too often, as people will just get confused and may not enjoy that as much. Even more non-player characters. Even more dragons. Pulling a lever. So talking about how to make players investigating things and opening crypts a little bit more interesting. And making your wandering monster table full of stuff that gives the dungeon character. Since wandering monsters tend to come up fairly infrequently in old school play, usually when they do come up, you want them to be something special. A table of new oddities. And Courtney is really great at designing stuff like this. A treasure table. For example, there is a item in here. I'm not sure where it is. It's around here somewhere. Where it's like a little hoop. And anything that you pass through the hoop becomes invisible until the next sunrise. So basically you make small items invisible. Or maybe your hand. Or things like that, right? So weird little tricks that a clever party or a clever player could make useful if they were smart. Those are my favorite kinds of items. A new type of monster to run into, the Canites and the Devil Dogs. Some soot specters, carrion moths, and an essay on restocking dungeons. This was especially helpful to me as I look more and more into doing Megadungeon play. The idea of going through each section of the dungeon and laboriously restocking it room by room sounds kind of exhausting to me. So he has some really short and simple principles for making old sections of a dungeon interesting again while doing a lot less work. And I really like that. Concrete, helpful advice. We have a short story by Chris H. about one of his campaigns. I like these little guest articles. It really gives you different views into the whole D&D scene. And we have, what I really like here is some ads from other OSR people. I just find it really charming. I'm not totally sure why. Hobbs and Friends of the OSR. I was on that show a little while back. In Search of Games. And of course, Ultraviolet Grasslands. And we have The Eye from Paolo Greco's Lost Pages imprint. So there we go. That's Megadungeon. Overall, I would say that I really enjoyed reading these. There's a lot of really great little articles in them. And even if you're not going to run the dungeon as such, it's a great example of a style of Megadungeon. He talks about why he's doing what he's doing, and you get to see it put into practice. So it's a really great inspiration for creating your own Megadungeon and the thought process that goes into that. One issue that I think could be improved a little bit is I did notice a lot of typos and some grammatical problems in a few sentences that caused me to read the sentence a couple times to try and figure out what exactly was being said. So perhaps another pass by a proofreader or an editor could probably take the zine as a whole up a notch. But it is, it's an amateur zine. It's put out by one guy. But that is something that I noticed. Overall, though, a really fascinating new zine. It's right at the beginning, so if you get it now, you can start collecting them from the very start. So great thing to get into, especially if you're thinking about running your own Megadungeon. So that's it for this review today. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I will put a link down in the description below where you can pick these up for yourself if that's something that you want to do. I like to thank my patrons over on Patreon for supporting the channel and keeping this whole thing going. You guys are amazing. And especially, I'd like to say, if you're going to be around next Wednesday, we're going to be doing something pretty cool. We're going to be looking at The Cursed Chateau, which is another Lamentations of the Flame Princess book. So we're moving out of the Megadungeon and we're moving into the haunted house. It's a crazy little book. I haven't read it in a lot of detail yet, but one thing is that, look, everything inside is gold foil. What the heck? Production values on these things are getting crazy. So join me next Wednesday. Thanks for watching the show as usual, and I will see you guys later.